Dust swirled in the blistering desert air as the wagons stood silent, their wooden frames groaning in the heat. Elowen Drakemire, her pale hair streaked with sand, stood frozen in the shadow of a looming wheel. Around her, a ring of mounted warriors closed in, their horses stamping the ground in restless rhythm. At the center of the circle sat Chief Veylak Stormfeather, his feathered headdress catching the sun, his face painted in dark streaks that seemed carved from stone. His gaze was fixed not on the caravan but directly on her. The sound of leather creaked as bows were drawn. Shadows of arrowheads cut across the dirt, trembling with the riders' breaths. The wind carried the low murmur of men waiting for a signal, a single motion that could unleash death. Elowen's throat tightened, but her small hand clutched the last scrap of bread she owned, half a roll, torn and ragged. It trembled between her fingers, absurdly fragile against the sea of warriors. She dared a step forward. Silence cracked louder than any gunshot. The riders' eyes narrowed, their stallions snorting clouds of dust. Chief Veylak leaned down, his massive hand extended with quiet, unreadable weight. For a heartbeat, time itself seemed trapped in the grip of what she would choose. Every soul around her, settlers and warriors alike, waited as if the desert itself held its breath. Then, with a gesture both defiant and childlike, Elowen raised the bread. Her tiny palm met the chief's hand, placing the broken piece into his grasp. The contrast was stark, her fingers small and trembling, his strong and scarred, the bread between them a fragile bridge where no words could pass. His warriors shifted uneasily, uncertain whether this was surrender or defiance. The chief did not eat. Instead, he lifted the bread high into the sunlight, his voice rumbling a single phrase in his native tongue. The warriors answered with a chorus that shook the air, their voices echoing across the canyon walls. Elowen's heart pounded, she could not understand the words, but she felt their weight like the crack of thunder before a storm. And that's when she realized, they hadn't come for the wagons, nor the cattle. They had come for her. The sun had been gentler then, resting low over the plains with a glow that turned the grasslands into rivers of gold. Elowen Drakemire walked barefoot along the ruts carved by wagon wheels, her dress dusted with earth, her pale hair whipping in the morning breeze. She carried a small basket no heavier than a sparrow, filled with scraps of bread and a flask of water. Her family had been traveling west for weeks, their wagon creaking beneath the weight of too many hopes and too few supplies. To her, the world was endless sky and dust, yet it was also fragile, always one misstep away from breaking apart. Her father worked the wagon wheel, tightening its iron rim with hands cracked from the desert wind. Her mother stitched a torn sleeve by the fire, the thread pulling tight in steady rhythm. They had taught Elowen to keep her eyes open, for the prairie was full of whispers, some carried by the wind, others by strangers who passed through their camp. That morning, a raven had circled above their trail, cawing in jagged bursts. Her father muttered that it was nothing, but Elowen felt a shiver settle into her bones. Later, she wandered a little from the wagons, her bare feet padding softly on the sun-warmed earth. She found a half-broken fence post abandoned near the edge of a dry creek. Squatting down, she traced its splintered wood, imagining the stories it could tell, perhaps of cattle long gone, or of men who once fought to keep their land. She often did this, touching objects and letting her mind weave their past. That day, however, she felt something else. A strange tension in the air, like the pause before thunder, though the sky was perfectly clear. By noon, the wagons had gathered in a circle, their white canvas tops glowing beneath the fierce sun. Families cooked thin stews and chewed hard bread, the smell of smoke and boiled beans drifting lazily on the wind. Elowen sat cross-legged near the fire, cradling the last small loaf she had managed to save. Her mother brushed the girl's hair and whispered, "Keep that close. It may be the only sweetness left." Elowen nodded, though she couldn't help but wonder why her mother's eyes seemed wet and far away. As the sun dipped lower, a rider appeared in the distance, a lone figure against the horizon. The adults stiffened, hands reaching for rifles resting by wagon doors. The rider did not approach, only watched from afar, then turned his horse and vanished into the brush. The silence he left behind was heavier than his presence. Children were called close, fires damped low, and whispers passed from mouth to mouth, "Someone is watching." That night, lying beneath the stars, Elowen pressed the small loaf against her chest. Sleep would not come easily. She couldn't name it, but she knew something was coming. Something that would change everything. Morning broke with a pale sky stretched thin across the plains, and the caravan stirred to life with the groaning of wagons and the shuffle of hooves. Elowen Drakemire rose quietly, clutching her loaf of bread, still uneaten, though her stomach had begged for it through the night. She stepped out to watch the horizon, her young eyes drawn again to the emptiness where the rider had vanished the evening before. Something about that lone figure haunted her. He had not looked like a trader or a lost ranch hand. He had carried no pack, no goods. He had simply watched. Around the fire, men spoke in clipped tones. "Could be scouts," muttered one, his beard gray and voice gravelly. "Railroad men pushing through, or worse, outlaws." Another shook his head. "Not railroad. Didn't see no tools, no steel. Looked more like them." His voice trailed off, but the others understood. The air tightened. It was the word none dared to say aloud: natives. Elowen felt her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with curiosity. Her father told her stories of raiding parties and bloody conflicts, but her mother had whispered softer tales, ones of peace, of moments when two worlds shared fire and food instead of bullets. By noon, a decision pressed on her heart. The memory of the rider's stare lingered, not cruel, not kind, only searching. She felt it pull at her, as though something unseen had tied her fate to his. She could have chosen to stay close to the wagons, to keep her eyes down like the others, but every step she took reminded her of the bread hidden in her pocket. Something in her whispered that it wasn't hers to keep, that it had a purpose she did not yet understand. Her chance came when she wandered to fetch water from a nearby creek. The current was weak, but the trickle of sound soothed her. As she filled the flask, she noticed movement among the mesquite trees, a flicker of leather, a shadow bending low. Her breath caught. The rider. He hadn't left after all. He sat silent on his horse, the animal blending into the landscape as if born from the dust itself. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, the man raised a hand, not a weapon, but a greeting. Elowen froze. Her heart thundered against her ribs, and the words of her father echoed: "If you see one, you run back. Don't hesitate. Don't speak." Yet her mother's voice rose too, softer. "Sometimes peace begins with the smallest gift." Her hand slipped to the bread in her pocket, her fingers trembling as they pressed against its crust. She knew she couldn't carry it back to camp without making a choice. In that instant, she realized the truth: to ignore him was to keep herself safe, but to step forward meant risking everything she knew. The decision lay heavy in her chest. When her eyes met his again, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her. Neighbor's warning, guns waiting, whispers of war thick in the air. And still, she reached for the bread. The following day dawned heavy with silence, the kind that seemed stitched into the very wind. Wagons creaked as the caravan moved forward, yet every turn of a wheel felt cautious, measured, like footsteps on sacred ground. Elowen Drakemire kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, but the image of the rider would not leave her. Even now, she felt his eyes on her, though when she looked across the plains, she saw only shifting mirages of heat and dust. The loaf of bread in her pocket felt heavier than iron, as if it alone carried the weight of some secret pact. Whispers moved faster than the wagons. Men argued in sharp voices over whether to push ahead or circle the camp early. Tracks in the dirt, someone muttered, pointing to fresh hoofprints pressed deep into the earth. Another swore he'd heard distant drums at night, faint but steady. Even the animals sensed it. Horses tossed their heads, refusing to drink from streams, while the oxen strained nervously against their yokes. Elowen's father said little, but she noticed the way his hand lingered near his rifle, his jaw set tight as stone. By midday, signs of intrusion grew impossible to ignore. A patch of grass smoldered where no fire should have been. An arrow, black-feathered and cruel, was found lodged into the bark of a tree along their path. Though no one admitted it aloud, the message was clear: they are close. Elowen, watching from the wagon, felt her skin prickle with both fear and an odd sense of inevitability. She alone carried the memory of the rider who had not raised a weapon, and she wondered if that meant something different than the men believed. That evening, the caravan halted near a dry canyon. Shadows stretched long, and with them came unease. As families cooked thin soup over small fires, rumors spread like sparks: they want the wagons. They're after the cattle. They'll strike when night falls. Elowen sat quietly, clutching her bread, her mother's hand resting firmly on her shoulder. But even as she listened, she sensed something deeper, that what was coming was not simply theft or battle. It was personal. Later, when the fires burned low, Elowen heard hoofbeats, slow, deliberate, circling just beyond the light. Shapes moved among the rocks, fleeting and silent. The men raised rifles, their shadows quivering against the wagon walls. Elowen's pulse quickened, and for the briefest moment she thought she saw the rider again, watching her from a ridge. His horse's silhouette was cut against the moonlight, still impatient, as if waiting for her choice to be complete. The threat was no longer distant rumor. It was here, pressing in from the darkness. And though the rifles were loaded and the men stood guard, Elowen knew with a certainty she could not explain that guns alone would not decide what came next. Something had begun, and it had begun with her. The standoff came at dawn. The first light stretched thin over the canyon walls, painting them in blood-red hues as the wagons stood still in a half-circle. Men with rifles crouched behind wheels and crates, their eyes fixed on the ridgeline above. From there, dark figures emerged, riders crowned in feathers, their horses breathing fog into the cool morning air. The silence shattered with a single call from the ridge, a sound that echoed like a war drum through the valley. Elowen Drakemire felt her heart hammer, the bread still clutched in her pocket as though it were the last thread holding her to hope. Chief Veylak Stormfeather did not appear, not yet. Instead, younger warriors descended first, circling the wagons with deliberate calm. They did not fire arrows or raise spears, they only watched, their painted faces unreadable. A man from the caravan, Ephraim Galt, could not hold his tongue. "Back off," he shouted, rifle lifted. His voice cracked against the canyon walls. One of the warriors snarled in his native tongue, and within seconds, bows were drawn. The air snapped with tension, one wrong breath away from blood. Then it happened. A misstep, a misunderstanding. Denton Hale, a hot-tempered rancher, discharged his rifle into the air, perhaps meant as warning, but the sound ripped through the fragile balance like thunder. Horses reared, men cursed, and in the chaos, an arrow streaked down and buried itself in a wagon's canvas. Families screamed as smoke and dust erupted around them. Elowen pressed herself against the ground, her fingers digging into the dirt, her eyes locked on the warriors who now seemed both terrifying and uncertain. Through the haze, she spotted him, the rider from before. He did not join the chaos. Instead, he sat tall on his horse, watching her with the same steady gaze she remembered from the creek. For a heartbeat, their eyes held, and she felt as though he were urging her to do something, though she could not yet name it. Around her, men scrambled to reload rifles while women pulled children beneath the wagons. A small victory came unexpectedly. Buckland Ward, the auctioneer turned caravan leader, stepped forward with hands raised. "Hold," he shouted to both sides. Against the odds, the warriors froze, listening, though their arrows remained drawn. For a moment, no shots rang, no blade struck. It was fragile, but it was peace enough to breathe. Elowen's father dragged her back toward the wagon, whispering harshly, "Don't look at them. Don't move." But her gaze lingered still on the rider who had not yet chosen a side. When the dust cleared, it was plain, this wasn't over. Neither side had won, neither side had retreated. The rifles were still loaded, the arrows still not. And deep in her chest, Elowen understood what the men could not: the battle wasn't about cattle, wagons, or land. Something larger loomed, and it was tethered to her every choice. The next time they met, it would not end without blood or a sacrifice. Night fell heavy over the canyon, the fires of the caravan burning low as men stood guard with rifles clutched tight. Elowen Drakemire sat near the embers, her pale hair reflecting the glow, a half-loaf of bread resting in her lap like a secret she could not share. Around her, whispers coiled like snakes. Some said the natives were preparing to strike at dawn. Others claimed the warriors wanted the cattle or the wagons. But Elowen sensed otherwise. She had seen the way the rider's gaze had fixed on her, not with hunger for goods but with something deeper, recognition. It was later, under a sky thick with stars, that the truth slipped into her hands. She had crept away from the wagons to fetch water, her steps light as a doe's, when she found herself face to face with the rider once more. His horse stood silent, nostrils flaring in the cool night, while he dismounted and approached without raising a weapon. In the faint light, Elowen could see his eyes clearly, dark pools that carried not threat, but sorrow. Slowly, he spoke in broken words of English. "You, child of Drakemire, you carry what belongs to us." Confusion struck her like a blow. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her fingers tightening around the bread. The man, Soren Ashvane, as he named himself, explained in low tones that the bread was no ordinary scrap of food. It had been baked with grain stolen seasons ago from the tribe's sacred stores, taken by settlers who had ignored the warnings of Chief Veylak Stormfeather. To return it now, even in its humble, half-eaten form, was more than a gesture. It was an act of restoration, a bridge across betrayal. Elowen trembled, for she had not stolen it, yet it had chosen her hands. Back at camp, she dared to question her mother in secret. Her mother's face went pale, and tears brimmed in her eyes. With a trembling voice, she admitted the truth. Years before, when famine had struck, Elowen's father had joined men who raided native fields. Grain had been taken, ground into flour, and hidden away. The bread that Elowen carried was the last remnant of that theft, baked quietly and saved during their long journey. Her mother had given it to her, never realizing it still carried the weight of a crime. Elowen's chest tightened. What she held was not merely food, it was history, betrayal hardened into crust. The truth burned within her. She was caught between two worlds, both demanding something she alone could give. She felt small, powerless, yet the writer's words lingered. Return it, and maybe peace comes. Refuse, and war will come instead. The burden pressed heavier than any rifle or blade. As the night deepened, drums began to thrum softly from the distant ridges, their rhythm pulsing like the heartbeat of the land. Men clutched their rifles tighter, preparing for blood. But Elowen knew that before dawn, she must decide. And whichever choice she made would shape not just the caravan's fate, but the balance between two peoples. Dawn cracked across the horizon like a blade, the canyon bathed in a pale red glow that made the air itself feel hostile. The caravan was restless, men pacing with rifles slung, children hidden beneath wagon tarps. Elowen Drakemire sat apart, clutching the bread close to her chest. She had hardly slept, her mind echoing with the writer's warning and her mother's confession. Now the weight of that truth pressed on her shoulders heavier than the desert sky. If she gave the bread back, perhaps peace could bloom, but if she failed, war would come swift and merciless. The first arrow struck the dirt near the wagons, a warning shot that made the oxen bellow and the men curse. More riders appeared along the ridges, shadows against the morning sun. At last, Chief Veylak Stormfeather himself emerged, his horse black as midnight, his headdress trailing like flames in the wind. His warriors flanked him in a semicircle, their bows drawn, eyes sharp as flint. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Veylak's voice rolled across the canyon, low and thunderous. The debt must be paid. Buckland Ward tried to reason, stepping forward with palms raised. We've no quarrel with you. Take cattle, take horses, just leave the people be. But the chief's gaze never left Elowen. He pointed directly at her, and the murmurs among the caravan turned sharp. Men shifted uncomfortably, some whispering that she had brought this doom upon them. Elowen's father yanked her behind him, rifle in hand, his voice breaking as he barked, "She's just a child." Yet even as he spoke, she knew it was useless. The warriors hadn't come for wagons or livestock. They had come for her, for the bread she carried. Suddenly, chaos erupted. A gunshot cracked from the caravan. Ephraim Galt, too nervous to wait, had fired blindly toward the ridge. The natives answered in a storm of arrows, wood splintering, canvas tearing, screams rising. Dust exploded into the air, choking, blinding. Elowen stumbled as her father shoved her beneath the wagon, but in the rush, the bread slipped from her hand, tumbling into the dirt. She scrambled after it, arrows slicing the ground around her, men shouting her name in panic. For one terrifying instant, she thought she would be trampled or struck before she reached it. Then, in the thick of smoke and screams, she saw him, the rider, Soren Ashvane. He spurred his horse through the chaos, swooping low to shield her with his body. Arrows thudded into the dust beside them, but none touched her. He shouted in his native tongue, and for a heartbeat, some of the warriors hesitated. Elowen clutched the bread again, her hands shaking, her breath ragged. She had nearly lost it, nearly lost everything. But as the smoke cleared, she realized the cost. The The caravan was in ruins, and blood stained the dirt. Both sides had suffered, and neither trusted the other anymore. Her chance to bridge them had not vanished, but it had narrowed to a single fragile thread. And now, with the chief's eyes fixed upon her, Elowen understood, the next step would decide whether she lived or died. The canyon floor was a scar of chaos, arrows buried in wagon wheels, smoke curling from spent rifles, and the cries of wounded men drifting into the morning air. Yet amid the ruin, a hush spread as Chief Veylak Stormfeather rode forward. His horse's hooves struck the earth like drums, slow and deliberate, until he stood at the very heart of the battleground. His gaze fell on Elowen Drakemire, small and trembling, clutching the crumbled loaf of bread. The caravan braced for the strike they believed inevitable. But Veylak raised his hand, and the warriors froze. Silence pressed tighter than any rope. Elowen's father tried to pull her back, but she broke free, stumbling into the open with dirt smeared across her face. She raised the bread high, her voice small yet unshaken. "It was taken," she said, the words tumbling out, "long ago. But it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to you." The chief studied her with eyes like obsidian, unreadable and heavy. For a moment, nothing moved. Then he dismounted, stepping toward her with the authority of a storm descending on dry land. Every settler behind her held their breath, waiting for the blade to fall. Instead, Veylak took the bread in both hands and lifted it to the sky. His voice rolled across the canyon in his native tongue, each syllable thick with power. Warriors lowered their bows, murmuring in unison, their voices swelling into a chant that sent shivers racing down Elowen's spine. She didn't understand the words, but she felt their meaning. The bread was not simply food, it was a symbol, a confession, an offering returned. And in that moment, she was no longer a child of the caravan. She was something else, something both sides would remember. Then came the twist. From the shadows of the canyon, a shot rang out, not from the natives, but from the settlers themselves. Denton Hale had leveled his rifle, aiming not at warriors but at Elowen. His face twisted with fear and rage. "She's cursed us all," he roared. The settlers gasped, torn between loyalty and terror. Before the bullet could strike, a figure hurled himself between Elowen and the shot. Soren Ashvane, the rider, staggered as the ball tore through his shoulder, dropping him to one knee. The bread tumbled from Veylak's hands into the dirt once more. A roar of fury erupted from the warriors, but Veylak raised his arm, halting them. His eyes burned, not with hatred, but with something deeper, a recognition of sacrifice. He bent, lifted Soren by the arm, and turned back to Elowen. "Your blood is not ours to spill," he said in halting English. The words rippled through the caravan like fire. The warriors lowered their weapons, but the settlers stood stunned, shaken by the realization that one of their own had tried to destroy the very peace they claimed to want. Hope flickered, fragile yet undeniable, in the dust-choked air. For the first time, the canyon did not feel like a grave, it felt like a place where two worlds might finally meet. But as the chief's eyes swept over the crowd, everyone knew the final choice had yet to be made, and it would test every soul gathered there. The canyon still pulsed with tension, the echo of the gunshot hanging in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. Elowen Drakemire stood frozen, her small hands streaked with dust and bread crumbs, her chest heaving. Soren Ashvane knelt nearby, blood soaking through his shoulder, yet his eyes never left hers, as if to remind her that he had chosen her side, even at the cost of his own flesh. Chief Veylak Stormfeather towered above them both, the bread once again resting in his grip. His warriors waited for his command, bows raised, while the settlers clutched their rifles with trembling fingers. At last, the chief raised the bread high once more, his deep voice breaking the silence. "The debt is paid." His words were sharp, deliberate, carried in both his tongue and in the fractured English he had learned. A murmur rippled through the caravan, disbelief and relief tangling together. The warriors lowered their weapons first, their chants fading into a solemn quiet. Slowly, cautiously, the settlers did the same. For the first time since the journey had begun, rifles were set down instead of raised. But resolution did not come without cost. Denton Hale, the man whose shot had nearly shattered it all, was dragged forward by two others, his face contorted with rage. "She's bewitched you," he spat, glaring at Elowen. "She's not a savior, she's the curse that'll finish us." His words echoed through the canyon, bitter and desperate. Yet no one stepped forward to defend him. His outburst was met not with agreement but with shameful silence. Even the settlers who once doubted Elowen lowered their eyes, unwilling to follow Hale's fury any longer. It was Buckland Ward, weathered and steady, who finally spoke. "The girl gave back what we never should have taken," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years. "If a child can show more courage than grown men, then maybe we've all been blind." His words cut through the crowd, shifting the mood like wind through tall grass. Elowen felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she held her ground, the bread's absence in her hands replaced by something else: responsibility, purpose. Chief Veylak stepped closer, placing the bread gently into a leather pouch tied at his side. He looked at Elowen, then at the settlers. "No more blood," he said firmly. "What was stolen is returned. Let it end here." The warriors bowed their heads in unison, a sign of respect not often given to outsiders. Slowly, the settlers nodded, their fear easing, their shoulders lowering as the invisible wall between them began to crack. The canyon exhaled at last. Smoke thinned, the cries of the wounded softened, and for a fleeting moment, both sides stood not as enemies but as survivors bound by one child's choice. Yet even as peace settled over the dust, Elowen knew scars would remain. Trust had been broken, lives had been lost, but something had shifted, something fragile yet real. For the first time, she believed the West might hold more than endless struggle. It might hold the chance for healing. Weeks later, the caravan rolled again across the open plains, the dust of the canyon now only a memory carried in scars and whispered stories. Elowen Drakemire sat atop the wagon bench, the wind pulling her pale hair back from her face. The bread was gone, yet she still felt its weight in her hands. Sometimes, late at night, she dreamed of giving it to Chief Veylak Stormfeather, of the way the sunlight had caught in his headdress as he lifted it high. She woke each time with the same thought, that a simple act of giving had changed more than rifles ever could. The settlers spoke of her differently now. Once they had called her a child, fragile and small, better hidden than heard. Now, when her name passed through the camp, it carried a tone of quiet respect. Buckland Ward often said that without her, blood would have drowned the canyon. Even her father, who had tried to shield her from every danger, now looked at her as though he saw someone older, someone carved by fire and shadow. She was still a child, but she had crossed a threshold that could never be undone. Soren Ashvane recovered slowly. His arm remained bound in rough cloth, but he rode alongside the caravan when he could, silent and watchful. He never asked for thanks, never claimed honor, though it was clear to all he had given his blood for her. Sometimes their eyes met across the dust, and in his gaze she saw neither debt nor regret, only a quiet acknowledgement that bound them as surely as kin. He belonged to another world, yet in some way, he had tied his fate to hers. Chief Veylak Stormfeather did not appear again, though the settlers often wondered if his riders shadowed them from afar. Still, when the fires burned low, the echoes of his voice lingered, "The debt is paid." The bread he had carried back became a symbol, retold in whispers as both warning and blessing. Some settlers called it luck. Others called it grace. Elowen, though, knew it was neither. It was a choice, carved in the space between fear and hope. Years later, the story lived on. Travelers passing through the plains spoke of the girl who gave her last bread to a chief, and how two sides on the brink of war stepped back from the edge because of it. Children leaned in close to hear the tale, eyes wide, voices hushed. And each time, the final moment was the same, a child's hand reaching out, fragile yet unflinching, bridging the unbridgeable. Elowen, grown and weathered by time, would tell it herself one day. And she would end it with the truth she had learned too early, but never forgot. Sometimes, in the West, the fastest straw wasn't the one that saved lives, it was the hand that reached out first.